Hi, welcome to another session of lectures by Lob-EZ. Today we're going to finish up the Protestant Reformation, so this is chapter 3.2, section C. Today we'll be discussing the Catholic Counter-Reformation, Mannerism, and Baroque art. So the Catholic Reformation is seen as a movement in response to the rise of Protestantism in Europe. Okay, so it has two names. Sometimes it's the Catholic Reformation, sometimes it's the Counter-Reformation, or you can join them together and sort of hyphenate it, make it Catholic Counter-Reformation. The deal is with the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the goal is to reunite Europe, religiously speaking. So sort of reestablish Christendom, and also a goal within the Catholic Reformation is to reform the Church. All right, and so this is a response to the rise of Protestantism throughout Europe. So the problem, though, with this reform movement and this attempt to reunify is that from a religious standpoint, we're dealing with a lot of conservative minds. So the willingness to reform their practices is fairly limited. There will be a good attempt to clean up some of the abuses and corruption that exists within the church, but when we look from a doctrinal standpoint, there's really very little that these conservative religious figures, these ecclesiastical figures, are going to be willing to make. So Pope Paul III is a person who is significant, which calls the church to look into these reports of corruption, and he calls for a council, a church council. This is something that, if we go back to Marsiglio of Padua, that he believed, there should be. Remember, he was the conciliarist movement, but really this council is limited because there's not I don't think there are any lay people that are in attendance, or at least making important decisions. It's primarily the Pope, cardinals, and bishops, and so that's where those conservative minds are. And so even though they have this hope of bringing Lutherans and Calvinists back to the church, they're very, that's their goal, but that's not going to happen because they're unwilling to make any compromise when it comes to certain doctrinal issues. So they sit, it looks like, 18 years. They meet intermittently and try to discuss these issues. So we're going to kind of go through some of the doctrinal issues that the church addresses, and you're going to see there's little. So when it comes to scriptures, they do recognize that much of the scriptures, the primacy of scriptures, that's what Calvin, that's what Luther had talked about. But they say both scriptures and the Pope are equal authorities. And so there's one other difference when we discuss Calvin or Lutheranism or Protestantism in general and Catholicism, is they have different Bibles. Most of the books are the same. Some of the translations are slightly different, but with the Catholic, or the Vulgate, if you will, there are some books that Protestants don't recognize, and so the Catholic version of the Bible is longer, and so that's where they claim a lot of the scriptural support for certain things like, the practice of indulgences and purgatory, for example. But the church states that the Pope and scriptures are equal authorities. All right, so the ultimate authority comes from both. And that because the Bible is so complicated, it isn't as simple as what Luther made it out to be, that it was much more complex and elaborate, and that only a trained theologian could understand certain passages, and so that's why they say the Pope or the Church were equal authorities with Scriptures. Both faith and good works were declared necessary. Of course, they're acknowledging the importance of faith, and so we're going to see an attempt made by the Church to introduce some spiritual nourishment for their followers, but also good works, the importance of good works, because that is what helps support and maintain your faith, according to the Council of Trent. 7 sacraments are all upheld, as is transubstantiation, and the importance of clerical celibacy. These are all upheld. They say that is spiritually more important to remain celibate. That is a state of spiritual purity, and so that's something that should be the ultimate aim. And again, the discussion of purgatory and indulgences. They talk about indulgences as the purview of the Catholic Church. So if that is something the Pope wants to do, he can do it. But the way that it was being used previously, they recognize that there were abuses, but that it could be used for the remittance of temporal suffering. So remember, the theory was if you don't do certain, like a penance, although your sin has been forgiven, the stain of the sin still remains on the soul, and so that you would have to perform these actions to get that stain removed, but that's not necessary if you receive an indulgence. And also, remember, if you die not having the stain of the sin removed, you go to purgatory. All right. So all of that is reaffirmed. The veneration of the saints, this idea that we pray to the saints so that they can intervene because of their elevated spiritual status, that they have, God's ear, if you will, and that praying to saints, we're not praying to saints as idols. Catholics aren't, but they are, asking the saints to intervene on their behalf. Okay, and so all of the things that used to be prominent are still upheld. So when we talk about reforming certain abuses, they took a very good stand against the abuses and the importance of making sure that the priests, the clergy members, are celibate, that they don't have girlfriends, that they're not abusing certain privileges that they have, and that they're also very well educated. And so the bishops have to oversee their diocese, okay? And so the bishop is in charge of several churches. The number varies, but it's a diocese would be sort of the same as a province or a state. And so everything that's within their diocese, all the churches, that's under the direction of one bishop. And the bishop has to make sure that he visits each parish at least once a year to make sure that everything is right. And so they also have to have a seminary. And a seminary is a place for training and education for the priests. Okay? They make a slight change to the sacrament of marriage, saying that it must be done before a priest. So the ceremony must be supervised, or the sacrament must be supervised and performed by a priest and witnesses to make sure that people weren't, I guess if in the case of secret marriages, that if one of the spouses wanted to leave the other, he or she could claim that, well, we were never married because it was done in private. So this makes a public record of it, and they say that it's, divorce is impossible unless through the death of a spouse. And so an attempt to try to prevent other Catholics from becoming Protestants, they come up with a list of, it's called the Index of Forbidden Books, and these are books that were considered dangerous to the spiritual or to the soul of Catholics, and so they were told not to read these books. And so obviously the works of Luther, Calvin, even Erasmus ended up on this index. So one of the ways that they attempted to draw people back in to Catholicism, or I guess, listen to the call that there wasn't enough spiritual nourishment, that the Catholic Church had become too focused on outward expressions of their faith. And so what they did was they start reforming some of the orders of nuns and brothers, and they establish new ones as well. And their mission is sort of outreach. Just kind of loosely or simply put, they're going to be dedicated to like three things: service to the poor, education, and then treating the sick. And that's where Catholic hospitals sort of become prominent. It's in response to the need to serve their people. Okay, and so we're going to talk about a couple of orders. The first would be the Carmelites, the Carmelite order, founded and established by Teresa of Avila. And so this convent is sort of a revival of asceticism, and we've talked about that in previous chapters. Asceticism is living a life completely devoid of any of any secular comforts. And so that the way to become closer to God is to sort of deny yourself of any worldly comforts or pleasures. And so this was typically only seen with orders of monks, but Teresa of Avila is establishing one for women, and there was pushback against it because was this really a role for women? But ultimately, she's able to establish this, and the Carmelite order becomes quite popular. They also took a vow, the Carmelites, of silence. They were only allowed to talk once a day, or like for an hour a day, and the rest of the time was to be spent working or in prayerful reflection. So Teresa of Avila was known for her spirituality, and we'll actually double back and talk about her a little bit later when we talk about Baroque art. Okay? So she wrote a piece of devotional tracts known as The Way of Perfection, and so this was something that she encouraged her followers, or those who joined the Carmelite order, to follow as well. Somebody else that's important is Angela Merici, and she establishes the Ursuline Order of Nuns, and so they're focused on education. Here in the St. Louis area, there's a Ursuline school, which is an all-girls school, secondary school. So that is something that they address, the importance of education for women if they're going to serve as mothers. And this, I think, kind of matches up nicely with Protestantism and the importance that wives had in educating their children. That they had a responsibility to help transmit their faith to their children. The same could be said of the Ursuline Order of Nuns. That's what, even if you went to a school founded or established by the Ursulines, that didn't necessarily mean that you were going to become a nun. You could, and then you would receive that education so that you could go and be sort of a teacher in other areas, because the Ursuline order becomes very popular. It spreads to America, and so obviously they would need educated nuns to become teachers in in other orders in other countries or cities. But also, if you chose to be a married person, that you could use that education to the spiritual development of your children. All right, so that's important to note. So, one of the criticisms of Protestantism is that there is not a role for women, but we see that there continues to be an important role for women within the Catholic Church. It's not equal to men, but at least that they have a, if they have like a vocation, a calling to serve God, they have a way to do that. And these saints continue to be a role model for other women. All right, and so that's important to note. Probably the most important figure of the Catholic Reformation is Ignatius of Loyola, a Spaniard who was a soldier who lived a very disciplined life, but following an injury, and he was well respected too for the level of discipline that he showed as a soldier, his bravery, his willingness to fight. The whole incident when the French laid siege to Pamplona, how he convinced, even though they were outnumbered, he convinced those defenders to not surrender, to continue fighting, and that was something that the French respected. And so when he was captured, or when the city was captured, he was taken care of, not killed, and allowed to, convalesce. They sent him to a hospital. So that speaks to kind of his personality. So it's there during his visit in the hospital that the only thing that he has to read are books about Jesus and the lives of saints, and it's during this time that he sort of has a spiritual awakening. And that's noteworthy because a number of the people that we've discussed in this unit have that. And so he sort of uses his discipline as a soldier to continue into, or to sort of translate into, a religious discipline. And so that's sort of going to be the hallmark of the religious order that he establishes: discipline, spiritual discipline. So he spends a lot of time concentrating on what God will, have him do. You could refer to it as meditation, if you will. But the Spiritual Exercises becomes a very famous book that he authored, and it's a way to achieve that, spiritual piety that many people say was lacking within the Catholic Church. Okay, and so he is able to develop a following, and they go to Rome, and they get an audience with Pope Paul III, and the Pope sort of gives him permission to establish a new order, and they're known as the Society of Jesus. And so one of the things that's noteworthy about the Society of Jesus is that they take traditional vows of celibacy and poverty, but also they take a vow of specific obedience or loyalty to the Pope. So that means that they're willing to serve the Pope in any way that he, they're sort of the soldiers of Christ. That doesn't mean they're going to take up arms. They're not, but they're willing to serve in any capacity in any location. So, people who are willing to join the Jesuits had to do so with the understanding that they might never see their homeland again, that they may be called to serve God overseas. And so many of them did, including Francis Xavier, and another, I guess, famous Jesuit priest was Matteo Ricci. And these two men are responsible for bringing Catholicism to Asia, most notably China and Japan. Although they didn't gather as many converts as we'll see in the Western Hemisphere with European exploration into the Americas, but they do have some success. Some of the other things that the Jesuits are called to do is to establish schools. And so Jesuits have become sort of world-renowned for their rigorous education. And it's a classical education. So you receive, training in Greek in some cases, but almost always in Latin. And so you're well-versed in a lot of the classical authors as well. And that sort of, is the hallmark of Jesuit education even today. And so the purpose, I guess, of the Jesuits is to convert people, and so they're going to serve as missionaries. They're going to serve as missionaries, as I said, to lands where Christianity does not exist, but also they're going to go into those parts of Europe which have converted to Protestantism, whether it be Lutheran or Calvinism. And so they have some success in bringing people back to the fold, to the Catholic fold. They don't have complete success, but that is sort of their goal. So they spread Christianity to the heathens of the world in non-Christian lands, but also to Protestant lands. So they have limited success there, and then the establishment of schools. And so that's sort of the noteworthy aspect of this. So when we talk about the legacy of the Reformation, one of the things is that Europe is no longer religiously united, that this is going to lead to this idea of, if the church is wrong, or if the Catholic Church was not the authority that it was once believed, what else is there that we don't know about? And so this is going to open the door to tremendous scrutiny, where what is known is going to be scrutinized, and that there's going to be a lot of interest in what isn't known. And so people are going to become curious about the world around them. And so we're going to see this is right on the heels of the era of exploration, overseas exploration, but then also the scientific revolution, and even a period known as the Enlightenment. So all of that can trace its roots with the Protestant Reformation. I guess something else, this importance of the Protestant work ethic can't be understated. This idea that if you work hard and you do so in a fashion that is pleasing to God, and that you're fair dealing, that if you happen to gain prosperity in your lifetime, that is a sort of an outward sign that God has favored you, that He is pleased with your approach. And so, I guess a modern day sort of equivalent or example of this would be sort of if you're familiar with the teachings of Joel Osteen, who has a tremendous following, but he does kind of focus on that if you devote your life to Christ, that you can be rewarded in this life. And so that sort of emanates out of the Protestant work ethic. So we see here the areas where Christianity has broken apart, that it's no longer united. The green reflects those areas that are Catholic. The blue, or this purple, would be Calvinists. This, whatever color, that lighter purple, will be the Lutheran areas, and then this blue area is Anglican. So make sure you're familiar with all of those regions. And now I want to talk about Mannerism. And so this is a movement of artwork that sort of begins after the fall of, or the sack of Rome in 1527, when the Renaissance artistic genre sort of comes to a close. There are some similarities between Mannerism and Renaissance art, but there are also some differences, obviously. So we'll talk a little bit about Michelangelo, because he's sort of the missing link, that connects late Renaissance artwork with early Mannerism. In fact, some of his later work, which we're looking at right now, it's called The Last Judgment, which was done late in his life, sort of denotes that new style. Okay, and so we'll look at it a little bit more closely. But so the term Mannerism was coined by critics of artists who were attempting to imitate the style of Michelangelo, and that they weren't doing it any justice. So initially the term Mannerism was not exactly favorable. All right, so I'll flip back and forth. So this you see about 300 or so sort of heavily muscled bodies. And so the first term or description of mannerism that we want to think about is exaggerated. All right, and so everyone is heavily muscled, and that's an exaggerated, a highly idealized form. Okay, so it's losing out on some of its realism and becoming exaggerated. So this scene right here shows Jesus. I mean, this is the last judgment. This is, the fulfillment of scriptures. The Apostles' Creed. He will come to judge the living and the dead. And so this is the final moment. And so what you see here, these people on Jesus's left are those people who are damned. These people on Jesus's right are those that are saved. And the metaphor of like a scale, that these people are going down and this part of the scale is going up into heaven. And so Jesus is the center point, the fulcrum, that is sort of deciding. And he is flanked by his mother, who, historically throughout scriptures is sort of among Catholics, she is the greatest interceder on behalf of the sinful. That, she's like a mother, always forgiving, and that she, even though you may deserve damnation, Mary is going to sort of try to find a way for you to, find salvation or redemption, probably. But here she's not doing that. She's sort of just acquiescing and sort of allowing Jesus to judge everyone. Okay, and so you can see these are angels who are blowing horns to sort of alert the dead that it's time to rise, and these other angels are holding the book of judgment, and you get to see whether or not your earthly deeds will bring you salvation or damnation. And so these dead souls are being brought up to heaven. And then in this next, we see angels pummeling those that belong in hell. And they're sort of fighting them off, attempting to fight them off. This is a painting here of St. Bartholomew, who was a saint who was flayed alive. And so he's holding his flayed skin in his hand. But if you look, some art historians think that this is sort of a portrait, if you will, of Michelangelo himself. And why would he put himself there? Well, there's another story of Apollo and a musician named Marsyas, who sort of challenged Apollo to a musical contest, and because he believed that he had the ability to play at a god's level, he was guilty of hubris, intense pride, and so his punishment was that he would be flayed alive. Why is Michelangelo? Well, Michelangelo believed that in his early days he was filled with hubris, and perhaps that hubris is what led him to have to chisel his name on his very first sculpture, the Pietà, because he wasn't getting the recognition that he thought he deserved. All right, so another Mannerist, or really the first Mannerist artist that we want to be familiar with is, I'm not going to try to, Domenicos Therakalopoulos, something like that. El Greco is his nickname, who was born in Crete, and which is off the coast of Greece, but moved to Spain, and so that's because people couldn't pronounce his name. They referred to him as El Greco, just the Greek. So he's probably the most famous Mannerist artist, and I really, when we'll get into expressionistic art or impressionistic artwork, which is late 19th century, you'll see that it seems as if it draws some influence from this artwork here. So I don't know. I think maybe perhaps could be considered a little ahead of his time. But this, I guess, the hallmark of his work are these distorted, elongated figures, and his interesting use of light and dark and shadowing, mysterious-looking clouds in the background, and these sort of ghostly or ashen hues that the bodies of humans are depicted with. So you're looking at this painting here. It's called Laocoon. Laocoon is this is a rendition of a story that goes to the epic Homer, the Iliad, when the city of Troy is being laid siege to by the Greeks, and they can't defeat or gain entrance. So the trick that the Greeks use is they build a horse sort of as a gift to the Trojans, and they say that they're leaving and going home, and that they're leaving as a parting gift, this Trojan horse. And so you may not be familiar, but the Trojan horse is wheeled into the city, and inside the hollowed out horse lie the Greek soldiers hiding, and they wait until night to sneak out and lay siege to the city, open the gates, and then just off in the distance are where the other Greek soldiers are hiding, and that's how they will ultimately defeat the Trojans. This Laocoon was a Trojan priest who knew about it. He just knew that this was a ruse, and he tried to convince his fellow Trojans not to believe it, that they should, burn the Trojan horse. And so the gods send 2 sea serpents as punishment to kill. And this is the classical rendition. This is a sculpture completed in the classical period. And you can see the serpents are killing the father and the 2 sons. And that's what this scene is here. And I guess these are the gods looking on. But you can see this son has already died. The father is about to be bit in the face, and this other son is wrestling, and he is looking like he's going to get bit in the side by the sea serpent. So, highly emotional scene as well. So this idea of anxiety and confusion help heighten the emotional sense. And so, there's obviously a lot of pain and suffering going on in this one. This is another painting, and you can see the clouds have sort of an ominous background. This Toledo is the city in Spain. The buildings are sort of distorted, and this hillside looks like it's even rounded or curved, probably more so than it would be in reality. And so that's sort of a telltale sign. Okay, so distorted, elongated, use of bright colors. These are all hallmarks of not just El Greco's work, but Mannerism in general. So we'll transition to another artistic style, and this is known as Baroque, 17th century, and it is one that is used by the Catholic Church as sort of a tool, if you will, to convince people to come back to the Catholic Church, to sort of symbolize the power of the Catholic Church and the importance of the lives of saints, that they really did tremendous things for people, and that those who have left the church should reconsider and return. It was also used by leaders, heads of state, who wanted portraits done of themselves or their family members, and that there were also some secular, so in those areas that did convert to Protestantism, there were artists there as well, probably less well known, and their pieces were not religious. So anyway. So when we look at architecture, this piece right here is by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. These are called the colonnades. You may be familiar with this structure. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So this was done after the fact. And so the colonnades are these giant, it's this giant piazza, okay? And so it looks as if the church is sort of, these colonnades come out, stretching out, almost like the arms of the church sort of welcoming people in. And so this area is very, very famous. And oftentimes the Pope will appear here, and hundreds of thousands of people will assemble to hear him speak. But that is sort of one of the more famous pieces. Here's another one. So these are very elaborate. This is the Trevi Fountain in Rome. Highly decorative, elaborate, almost over the top, exaggerated architecture. And then when we look at churches decorated in the Baroque style, extremely elaborate, an attempt to evoke an emotional response from people when they look at the artwork. Here is a sculpture by Bernini, and this is known as the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Okay, and so Teresa was a mystic. She established the Carmelite order, and she is believed to have had visions, an epiphany. And in one of these epiphanies, she recounts that she was stabbed in the heart by an arrow from an angel, and that the result was an intense spiritual, even physical pleasure. And so this spiritual ecstasy that she undergoes is depicted by Bernini. And so you can see from her facial expressions that she is, in fact, experiencing physical and spiritual pleasure or ecstasy. Okay, so it's not done to, it's not meant to be sexual in nature, but I can understand how people could mistake that, but that is definitely not the purpose of it. So this is, her having one of her epiphanies, and so that's a kind of a new term that we're beginning to see more and more often throughout this unit. All right. Peter Paul Rubens is another artist who is important, and he did a lot of pieces of saints. This is Ignatius of Loyola, but he also did, he was also sort of commissioned by the Mericis in France. Marie de Medici, I think he did over 20 paintings of her, and we see some nudity and some voluptuousness, and this is sort of to heighten the emotional intensity of the scene. So that is also a hallmark when you see, they almost look, slightly overweight. Who knows? Voluptuous is a good enough term. But nudity will be seen, and that is a hallmark of Baroque as well. All right, but more the secular pieces. So here's a famous painting, The Miracles of St. Ignatius. He's curing people who are sick, who are infirmed, people who have demonically possessed. He's casting out demons, and this is this is an attractive quality of Catholicism, that you can receive healing, not just your soul. Can you gain salvation for your soul, but you can receive healing, and because medical treatment was ghastly at this time period. I mean, there was a strong chance that you could benefit from some sort of injury or ailment, and so this is an appeal of the Catholic Church. This is something that the Protestants don't say they can do. Only the Catholic Church offers this, and so this is really a sort of a tool to be used to try to get people to rejoin the Catholic Church. Other scenes or other paintings by Peter Paul Rubens as well. The stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi. These are the wounds of Christ. That's called the stigmata. So only those people who are truly pious and devoted, sort of as a gift, you would receive the wounds of Christ. So only those that were really holy would receive that. One other and final figure that we'll talk about is Artemisia Gentileschi. She was a female artist who chose to depict females, typically heroines, and oftentimes biblical figures. Okay, and so one of the heroines that she painted a number of different times was Judith, who beheaded Holofernes, who was a Syrian general who had violated her, and so her and her maidservant snuck in one night while he was asleep, and they decapitated him. So this is biblical, and so she depicts this to show the strength that women have, and so sort of a feminist artist in the making here. Okay, and this was very rare for female artists to depict other women, so that is something that Gentileschi is responsible for. The last piece of Baroque architecture we'll depict here. This is the Hall of Mirrors. We'll actually see it later when we discuss Louis XIV, but this is at the Palace of Versailles, and again you can see this highly elaborate scene that the Hall of Mirrors is designed to reflect light, so it's an attempt to reflect the power of the monarch. And Louis XIV was sort of considered the epitome of absolute monarchs. That is a form of monarchy that we have yet to discuss, but we will do so shortly. So that'll be it for section 3.2C, Catholic Reformation, Mannerism, and Baroque art. Thanks for watching.